on. I can do this. I can do this today. I can do this today. And welcome back to another episode of our book club series. So we left off on page 53 of the Pact. This is going to be reading number 5. I'm going to read the last couple of sentences, that way we're all like back on the same page and we remember where we picked up. He spent 5 minutes trying to get Chris to speak to him again, to spit out a detail or a piece of information that he could carry with him in his breast pocket, the way one might tuck the note of a lover or a lucky charm. But when Michael left the room, the only thing he knew for certain was that Chris had not been able to look him in the eye. And that's where we left off. Anne-Marie Marone closed the door to her office, kicked off her shoes, and sat down with the faxed autopsy report of Emily Gold. She curled her feet up beneath her on the chair and closed her eyes, intentionally clearing her mind so that she would not prejudge what she was about to read. Then she raked her fingers through her hair and stared until the words began to swim on the page. The patient was a 17-year-old white female, admitted unconscious after a gunshot wound to the head. Within minutes of admission, patient's blood pressure dropped to 50/70 over palpable. Patient was pronounced dead at 11:31 p.m. Gross examination revealed powder burns surrounding the entrance wound at the right temple. The bullet had not cut a clean path across the head, but had crossed the temporal and the occipital lobes of the brain and nicked the cerebellum, to exit somewhere right of center in the rear of the skull. A fragment matching a .45 caliber bullet had been found in the occipital lobe. Wounds were consistent with a .45 caliber bullet fired directly against the skull. All in all, a death that suggested Christopher Hart had related. Anne-Marie felt the hairs stand up on the back of her neck as she read through the second page of the autopsy report. The external examination had revealed bruising on the right wrist. The medical examiner had found flakes of skin beneath Emily's fingernails. Signs of struggle. She stood up, thinking of Chris Hart. She had not yet received a report from forensics on the Colt, but that didn't matter. It had been procured from his house. His fingerprints would be all over it. It remained to be seen whether Emily's would as well. Something niggled at her mind, and she looked back at the first page of the report. The medical examiner had only roughly explained the entry and exit wounds, but they did not seem quite right to Anne-Marie. She took her right hand, pointed the finger like it was a gun, and held it to her temple. She cocked her thumb to pretended to shoot. The bullet should have come out near Emily's left ear. Instead, it exited in the back of her head, a few inches behind her right ear. Anne-Marie twisted her wrist so that her imaginary gun would point in a similar path. It involved her lifting her elbow and angling it in an odd fashion so that the gun was almost parallel to the temple. A highly uncomfortable and unnatural position from which to shoot oneself in the head. Yet the bullet trajectory made perfect sense if the person who shot the gun was standing in front of you. But why? She flipped to the last page of the autopsy to read about the gross examination of the gallbladder, the gastrointestinal tract, the reproductive system. Suddenly she caught her breath. Slipping back into her shoes, Anne-Marie lifted the telephone and dialed the Attorney General's office. 1 second, I'm going to get some coffee. Look at my Machu Picchu cup. Mrs. Gold, the detective had said on the phone, I have the autopsy results on your daughter. I'd like to come over at your convenience and show them to you. Melanie had played the words over in her mind. Something about Detective Marone's request had stuck in her craw, and she turned the sentences around, wondering what it was that seemed odd, studying them through different filters as if her mind were a kaleidoscope. Perhaps it was the detective's politeness, so diametrically opposed to the last few times she'd barreled into their grief. Perhaps it was simply hearing the words autopsy and your daughter in the same short breath. Melanie and Michael sat on the couch, wide-eyed and clutching each other's hands like refugees. Detective Marone sat across from them on a tufted chair. Spread out on the coffee table were the facts and statements of Emily's body, the last information she had to give. Let me get right to the point, the detective said. I have reason to believe that your daughter's death was not a suicide. Melanie felt her whole body soften like butter out in the sun. Wasn't this what she had been hoping for? This absolution by a law enforcement expert who was now saying it wasn't your fault. You didn't see signs of your daughter's impending suicide because there was nothing to see. The state of New Hampshire believes there is sufficient evidence to take this case to a grand jury and have them hand down an indictment for murder, the detective was saying. Whether or not you, as Emily's parents, choose to be involved, the case will still proceed. But we hope that you'll comply with requests from the Attorney General's office if need be. I don't understand, Michael said. You're suggesting that your daughter was killed, Detective Marone said, unblinking. Most likely by Christopher Hart. Michael shook his head. But he said that Emily shot herself, that they'd planned to kill themselves together. I know what he said, the detective replied more gently. But your daughter said something different. She lifted the first page of the autopsy report, covered with foreign markings and measurements. In a nutshell, the medical examiner confirmed that Emily was killed by a gunshot wound to the head. However, she gestured further down the page, outlining bodily evidence of violence and Emily fighting back. Melanie stopped listening. She folded her hands in her lap and pretended that Chris Hart was minuscule and hidden within them. She crushed her palms together, flattened them until he would have no room to breathe. Wait, Michael said, shaking his head. I don't believe this. Chris Hart wouldn't have killed Emily. There's not a malicious bone in his body. For Christ's sake, they grew up together. Shut up, Michael, Melanie gritted out. He turned to her. You know I'm right, he said. Shut up. Michael glanced at the detective again. Look, I watch the legal shows on TV. I know that mistakes can be made, and I know that every piece of evidence you found in that autopsy probably has a perfectly logical explanation that has nothing to do with murder. He exhaled slowly. I know, Chris, he said quietly. If he said that he and Em were going to kill themselves, well, then I don't understand why, and I'm shocked to find out, but I believe that that's what they were going to do. He wouldn't lie about something so painful. He might, Anne-Marie said, if his own life depended on it. Detective Marone, Michael replied, I mean no disrespect, but you met these kids 3 days ago. I've known them all their lives. Michael had the distinct impression that Anne-Marie was sizing him up. What kind of father vouched for the boy who might have murdered his daughter? You're saying that you know Chris Hart well, she stated, as well as I knew my own daughter. The detective nodded. Then it should come as no surprise, she said evenly, flipping to the final page of the autopsy, when I tell you that Emily was pregnant. Dun dun dun. Hold on. Coffee break. Okay. 11 weeks, Melanie said dully. She knew for 2 months. I should have known. Tampons never made it to the shopping list. She twisted the sheets between her hands. I never even knew they were sleeping together. Neither had Michael. Since Detective Marone had left, that was what he'd been imagining. Not that teeny peanut life inside Emily's body, but what had brought it there, the strokes and caresses that peeled away the layers of girl to reveal a woman no one else had wanted to admit existed. That's probably what they were fighting about, Melanie murmured. Michael rolled over and faced his wife. Her profile ribboned against the edge of the pillow, kept shifting and realigning so that he could not see her clearly. Who? Chris and Em, Melanie said. He would have wanted her to get rid of it. Michael stared at her. And you wouldn't? a year before she was set to go off to college? Melanie sniffed. I would have wanted her to do whatever she felt she had to do. You're lying, Michael said. You're only saying that now because it doesn't matter. He levered himself up on an elbow. You don't even know if she told Chris. Melanie sat up in bed. What is the matter with you? She hissed. Your daughter is dead. The police have believed that Chris killed her, and you are defending him at every turn. Michael glanced away. The bottom sheet was wrinkled, as if time took its toll on a marriage bed as surely as it would on a face. He tried in vain to smooth it. You told me at the funeral home that fancy trappings weren't going to bring him back. Well, neither is crucifying Chris. The way I see it, he's all we have left of her. I don't want to see him buried, too. Melanie stared at him. I don't understand you, she said, and picking up her pillow, she fled from the bedroom. Next section. On Tuesday morning, when the sun first slitted its eyes, James was already awake and dressed. Some of these sayings, some of these phrases get me. It's like, I don't know if it's like a dialect from some specific area or if it's just like old-fashioned. James was already awake and dressed. He stood on the porch, his breath coming in small circles, clutching a stack of yellow posters in one hand. Rifle season for deer was almost over, but James had been determined. He'd finally located some signs that he'd purchased years ago and had forgotten in the attic. Slipping a hammer through the loop of his belt, he struck off toward the perimeter of his property, listening to the jangle of nails in his pocket. At the first tree beside the driveway, he yanked loose the hammer and pounded a nail through the first sign. Then he moved to the second tree, just a few feet away, and he put up another. Safety zone, they read. More urgent than a traditional posted sign, they let hunters know they were within 300 feet of a residence, that a stray bullet could have dire consequences. James moved to the third tree and the fourth. The last time he had done this, when Chris was just a child, he'd hung the signs every 20 feet or so. This time, he hung a sign on every single tree. They rustled in the light wind, 100 yellow warnings, garish and obscenely festive against the dark trunks. James stepped out on the road to look at his handiwork. He stared at his signs, thinking of amulets carried, of red worn to ward off the evil eye, of Hebrews painting lamb's blood on doorposts, and he wondered what exactly he was trying to keep away. Then, 1989. So we're back again, in the past. Chris huddled beside Emily, their hands twined together around the telephone receiver. You're chicken, he murmured, as the dial tone swam in his ear. Am not, Em whispered. There was a pickup on the other end. Chris felt Emily's fingers flutter above his wrist. Hello? Em lowered her voice. I'm looking for Mr. Longwanger. I'm sorry, the woman said. He's not available right now. Can I take a message? I'm sorry, she said. He's not available right now. Can I take a message? Em cleared her throat. Does he really have one? Have what? The woman asked. A Longwanger? Then Em slammed down the receiver, rolling to her side in a fit of giggles and a flurry of phone book pages. It took Chris a while to stop laughing. I didn't think you'd do it, he said. That's because you're a dork. Chris grinned at her. At least my last name isn't Longwanger. He skimmed his hand over the page where the phone book had fallen open. What should we do next? He asked. Here's a Richard Wrestler. We could ask if there's a dick in the house. Here's a Richard Wrestler. We could ask if there's a dick in the house. Emily flopped onto her belly. I know, she said. Call your mom and tell her you are Mr. Chambers and Chris is in trouble. Like she's going to believe I'm the principal. Em smiled slowly. Here, chickie, she crooned. You do it, Chris challenged. She won't recognize the school secretary. What will you give me? Emily asked. Chris dug in his pockets. $5. Em held out her hand. She shook it. He shook it and handed her the telephone. She dialed and pinched her nose. Yes? She drawled out. I am looking for Mrs. Hart. This is Phyllis Wright at the principal's office. Your son is in trouble. Emily looked wildly at Chris. What kind of trouble? Well, we'd like you to come down here and get him. She quickly hung up the phone. "What did you do that for?" Chris groaned. "She's going to drive all the way down there and find out I left an hour ago. I'm going to be grounded for the rest of my life." He ran his hands through his hair and then fell onto his side on Emily's bed. She spooned behind him, her chin hooked over his shoulder. "If you are," she murmured, "I'll stay with you." Chris sat with his head bowed, his parents standing over him like sequoias. He wondered if this was what marriage was all about. One of them picking up to yell when the other one's voice trailed off, as if they were really one giant with two separate heads. "Well," his mother huffed, finishing the tirade, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" "I'm sorry," Chris automatically returned. "Sorry doesn't make up for stupidity," his father said. "Sorry doesn't bring back the appointment your mother had to cancel when she went to get you at school." Chris opened his mouth to say that if she'd reasoned logically, she would have realized no kids were at school that late in the afternoon, but thought better of it. He ducked his head again, staring at the weave of the carpet, wishing that while he and Em were making prank calls, he hadn't forgotten that his mother was in the middle of starting up her own business. But it was so soon into it, how was he supposed to remember? And what kind of job was hanging around in lines nobody else wanted to waste time on? "I had expected better of you and Emily," his mother said. Well, that wasn't a surprise. Everyone always expected better of him and Emily, as if they knew some grand plan that Emily and Chris did not. Sometimes Chris wished he could sneak a peek at the back of the book, so to speak, and see how it was all going to turn out so that he wouldn't have to bother going through the motions. "Except for school, you are going to stay in this room for 3 days, his father said. "Let's see if that gives you enough time to think about how many people you've inconvenienced with your little jokes." Then one giant monster, both of his parents, stepped out of his bedroom. Chris flopped back onto the bed and threw his forearm over his eyes. God, they were such pills. So what if his mother demanded to speak to Mr. Chambers, who of course knew nothing about Chris getting in trouble? No one was going to remember a month from now. He opened the curtains at one of his bedroom windows. Facing dead east, it stared directly at Em's bedroom. They couldn't really see each other from that distance, but they'd realized that at least the small square of light in the window was visible. Chris knew that Emily was being read the riot act, too. He wasn't sure if her parents disciplined her in her bedroom or in the kitchen or whatever. He sat down beside the lamp near his bed and flicked off the switch, blackening the room. Then he flicked it back on and off and on and off and on. 4 long bleats of darkness, then 3 short ones. He stood up and waited by the window. Emily's room, a small yellow square cut by the limbs of trees, went black, then bright again. They had learned Morse code at camp last summer. Emily's room kept flickering. H-I. Chris flicked his thumb over the lamp space again. How bad? Emily's room darkened twice. Chris signaled out 3. He smiled and leaned back on his bedspread, watching Emily's words to him light up the night. Outside in the hallway, Gus and James collapsed against the wall and tried not to laugh. "Can you believe," Gus gasped, "they called a man named Longwanger?" James grinned. "I don't know that I would have been able to restrain myself either." "I feel like such an old fart shouting at him," Gus said. "I'm 38, and I might as well be Jesse Helms." "We had to ground him, Gus, or else he'll be dialing around and asking for Prince Albert in a can." "What is Prince Albert in a can?" James groaned and tugged her down the hall. "You're never going to be the old fart, since I'll be holding that title." Gus walked into their bedroom. "Fine. You can be the curmudgeon. I'll be the crazy lady who barges into the principal's office and insists that her son's done something wrong." James laughed. "They did get you, didn't they?" She threw a pillow at him. James grabbed her ankle, making her squeal and roll away from him. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "I may be old, but I'm not dead." He pressed her body beneath his, feeling her go soft, tracing the undercurves of her breasts and the chords of her throat. His mouth came over hers. Gus let herself remember what it had been like over a decade ago, when the house still smelled of planed wood and fresh paint, and time was a gift given from the hospital scheduler. She thought back to how she and James would make love on the kitchen table, in the mudroom, after breakfast, as if the pressure of being a resident had knocked all those Mayflower sensibilities from his mind. "You," James said against her temple, "are thinking too much." Gus smiled against his neck. She was rarely accused of that. Maybe I ought to just feel then," she said, slipping her hands up under James's shirt as the muscles in his back tightened in sequence, like a tide. She pushed him onto his side, slid down his zipper, took the heat of him into her hands. Then she looked up, eyes sparkling. "Mr. Longwanger, I presume?" James grinned. "At your service." He moved over her, into her. She drew in her breath, and then she was not thinking at all. "I feel you on that, girl." Dear Diary, the class guinea pig Blizzard is having babies. Today in school, Mona Rippling said she kissed Kenny Lawrence behind the wall mats during gym, which is totally crazy because everyone knows Kenny is the grossest of all the other boys in fourth grade, except for Chris. But Chris isn't like all the other boys. Chris is reading an autobiography of Muhammad Ali for his book report. He asked what I was doing, and I started to tell him about Lancelot and Guinevere and King Arthur, but then I stopped. He'd probably want to know about knights, and those are the parts I've been skipping. The best chapters are where Guinevere spends time with Lancelot. He has dark hair and dark eyes. He does things like lift her off her horse and call her my lady. I bet he treats her like the crystal egg Mom has, that she won't let anybody even breathe near. King Arthur is an old guy and a jerk. Guinevere should just run off with Lancelot because she loves him and because they were meant for each other. I think it's very romantic. If Chris knew I was crazy over fairy tales, I'd just die. Later that week, on a dare from Emily, Chris stole The Joy of Sex from the library stacks. He hid it under his coat until they were home, and at their secret place. The boulder was shaped like an upside-down triangle, the broad slab of rock at the top providing a ledge to perch on or cower beneath, depending on one's imagination. At different points in their childhood, it had been home base for hide and seek, a pirate's cave, an Indian's lean-to. Chris scuffed away some of the soft pine needles on the ground. He pulled the book out and sat down beside Emily. For a moment, neither said a word, tilting their heads to take in the drawings of twined limbs and grasping hands. Emily ran her finger over the pen and ink flanks of a man rearing over a woman. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't see anything joyous about that." "It must be different when you're really doing it," Chris answered. He turned the page. "Wow," he said. "That's like gymnastics." Emily flipped back to the beginning of the book. She stopped at a page that showed a woman on top of a man, stretched along the length of him, their hands clasped together over their heads. "Big deal," Chris said. "You've pinned me 1,000,000 times. But Emily didn't hear him. She was captivated by the facing page, which depicted a man and a woman joined but sitting up, their legs splayed like two crabs, their hands holding onto each other's shoulders for purchase. Their bodies together looked like a big bowl, as if the whole reason for having sex was to create something that could hold all the feelings they had for each other. It must be different when you love somebody, Emily reasoned. Chris shrugged. It must be, he said. Gus was changing the sheets on Chris's bed when she found The Joy of Sex hidden between his mattress and box spring. She picked up the book and leafed through the pages, finding positions she had long forgotten existed. Then she hugged it tightly to her chest and walked outside, heading toward the Golds. Melanie opened the door with a mug of coffee in one hand and took the book Gus held out wordlessly to her. Well, she said, studying the cover, this certainly goes beyond the call of neighborly duty. He is only 9, Gus exploded, dropping her coat on the floor of the kitchen and sinking into a chair. 9-year-olds are supposed to be thinking of baseball, not sex. I think they're mentally linked, Melanie suggested. You know, getting to first and second base and all that. Who let him check this out in the library? Gus demanded, turning to her friend. What kind of adult lets a child do something like that? Melanie scanned the rear of the book. No one, she said. This was never checked out. Gus buried her face in her hands. Great, he's a pervert and a thief. The kitchen door swung open, and Michael came through, carrying a large box of veterinary supplies. Ladies, he greeted, dropping the box heavily to the floor. What's up? He peeked over Melanie's shoulder and, grinning, took the book from her hands. Wow, he said, flipping through the pages. I remember this. But were you 9 when you read it? Gus asked. Michael laughed. Can I take the 5th? Melanie turned to him, surprised. You were aware of girls that young? He kissed the top of her head. If I didn't start early, he said, I wouldn't be the dynamo I am now. He sat down in the chair across from Gus and slid the book toward her. Let me guess. You found it under his mattress. It's where I used to keep my penthouse. Gus rubbed her temples. If we ground him again, Child Protective Services is going to show up at our door. She glanced up miserably. Maybe we shouldn't even punish him, she said. Maybe he's just looking for answers about girls. Michael raised his brows. When he finds them, will you tell him to come talk to me? Melanie sighed sympathetically. I don't know what I'd do in your shoes. Melanie sighed sympathetically. Michael raised his brows. When he finds them, will you tell him to come talk to me? Melanie sighed sympathetically. I don't know what I'd do in your shoes. Who says you're not? Gus pointed out. How do you know Em isn't in on this? Everything else those two do, they do together. She looked at Michael. Maybe she's the mastermind. Em's 9, he said, appalled by the thought. Exactly, Gus said. Next section. Gus waited until she heard the sound of her son tearing his room apart. Then she knocked on the door to be met by a whirlwind of clothing, mitts, hockey sticks, and anguish. Hi, she said affably. Lose something? She watched Chris turn several rich shades of red. Then she drew her hands out from behind her back. Lose this? She asked. This isn't what it looks like, Chris said immediately, and Gus was astounded. When had he learned to lie so easily? What do you think it looks like? Like I've been reading something I shouldn't have? Gus sank down on his bed. Are you asking me or telling me? She gentled her voice, stroked her palm over the cover of the book. What makes you think you shouldn't be reading it? Chris shrugged. I don't know, the naked pictures and all. Is that why you wanted to read it? I guess, Chris said, looking so miserable she almost felt sorry for him. It seemed like a good idea at the time. She stared at the crown of her son's head and remembered how, when he was born, a labor nurse had held a mirror between her legs so that she could see it appear dark and downy for the first time. Can we just forget about it? Chris begged. She wanted to let him off, seduced by the way he was squirming beside her, a butterfly on a pin. But she chanced to look down at his hands, clenched over each bony knee. They were no longer toddler soft, each digit puffy, like the hands on the balloons at Thanksgiving parades. At some point, when Gus was too busy to notice, they had turned knuckled and blue-veined, larger even than hers, hands that already reminded her of James's. Gus cleared her throat, aware that this boy sitting in front of her, whose face she could have identified by touch alone, whose voice said her name before any other word, was someone she did not recognize. He was someone who heard the word woman and no longer thought of Gus's features and a mother's embrace, but of a faceless girl with breasts and curved hips. When had this happened? If you have questions, about this, you can always ask your father or me, Gus managed, praying that he'd hit up James. She wondered what had compelled her to confront Chris in the first place. At this point, it was a toss-up as to who was more embarrassed. I do. Chris looked into his lap, twisting his hands together. Some of the stuff in that book, well, he lifted his gaze. Some of it doesn't look like it would work so well. Gus touched her hand to her son's hair. If it didn't work, she said simply, we wouldn't have you. Next section. Emily and Chris sat under the tent of a blanket on her bed, a flashlight balanced between their bare feet. Chris's parents, off to some hospital charity ball, had asked the Golds to sit for him and his sister. Kate had gone to bed after her bath, but Chris and Em were planning to stay up past midnight. Melanie had tucked them in just before 9 and called for lights out. But they knew if they were quiet, no one else would be the wiser. So, Chris pressed, truth or dare? Truth, Emily said. The worst thing I ever did was call your mom and pretend to be the principal's secretary. That's not true. You forgot the time you poured nail polish remover on my mom's bureau and blamed it on Kate. I only did it because you told me to, Emily whispered fiercely. You said she wouldn't know any better. Then she frowned. Anyway, if you knew the worst thing I ever did, why do you even ask the question? Okay, I'll ask another one, Chris said. Read me what you wrote in your diary when I was brushing my teeth. Emily gasped. Dare. Chris's teeth gleamed white in the glow of the flashlight. Sneak into your parents' bathroom, he said, and bring back their toothbrushes so I know you did it. Fine, Emily said, throwing back the covers. Her parents had gone to sleep half an hour ago. Surely they wouldn't still be awake. The minute she was gone, Chris stared at the teeny paisley-covered book into which Emily poured out her heart every single night. It had a lock, but he could jimmy it. He touched his hand to the back of the diary and then snatched it back, his palm burning. Was he chicken because he knew Em wouldn't want him to read it? Or was he afraid of what he might see? He shook the book and eased it open. His name was all over the place. His eyes widened. Then he slapped the diary back down onto her desk and went back to the bed, certain that guilt was written across his forehead. Here, Em said. Breathless, crawling back onto the bed, she held out the 2 toothbrushes. Your turn. She tucked her feet beneath her. Who's the prettiest girl in 5th grade? Well, that was a no-brainer. Emily would expect him to say Molly Edisley, the only 5th grader who really needed a bra. But if he did say Molly, he knew that Emily would get pissed off, because he was supposed to be her best friend. His gaze cut to the diary. Did Em really think of him as some knight? Dare, he muttered. Okay. And before Emily could edit her thoughts, she told Chris he had to kiss her. He threw the blanket off their heads. I what? You heard me, Em said, frowning. It's not as bad as sneaking into my parents' bathroom. His hands were sweaty all of a sudden, so he wiped them on his knees of his pajamas. Okay, he said. He leaned forward and pushed his mouth up against hers. Then he drew back, just as flushed as Emily. Well, he announced, wiping his lips with the back of his hand. That was pretty gross. Em gently touched her hand to her chin. Definitely, she whispered. The one McDonald's in Bainbridge, New Hampshire, sported a changing battalion of teenage workers who slaved over greasy grills and oil pits until they up and graduated. But for several years, one man had worked there consistently. In his late 20s, he had long black hair and a wall eye. Adults politely said there was something wrong with him. Kids called him the creep and fashioned stories about him roasting infants in the French fryer and cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife. On the afternoon that Chris and Emily were eating lunch there, the creep was on the cleanup duty in the dining room. Chris's parents had come over at lunchtime, his mother swooping down like a hawk to kiss his forehead. After gossiping with Emily's mom about who was wearing what to the party the night before, Gus offered to take Emily out to the McDonald's with them for lunch. A thank you for babysitting overnight. They had carried their trays to the dining area, but every time Emily turned around, the creep was at the table beside her, or behind her, or just in front, rubbing down the slick formica surface and staring at her with his one straight eye. Chris sat beside her on the banquette. I think, he whispered, he's your secret admirer. Stop it, Em shuddered. You're freaking me out. Maybe he'll ask for your phone number, Chris continued. Maybe he'll... Chris, Emily warned, punching him in the arm. What's going on? Gus asked. Nothing, they answered in unison. Emily watched the creep make his rounds, picking up ketchup packets people had dropped on the floor and mopping up a spilled Coke. He looked up at her as if he could feel her eyes on him, and she immediately stared down at the seeded bun of her hamburger. Suddenly, Chris leaned over to whisper again. His breath was hot in the shell of her ear. "Ultimate dare," he said. An ultimate dare was one that raised you in the other person's estimation by leaps and bounds, if completed. Not that they were keeping count, but if they were, it would definitely put him in the lead. She wondered briefly if this was Chris's way of getting back at her for the kiss the night before. The last ultimate dare challenge issued had been by Emily. Chris had mooned an entire residential street from the window of the school bus. She nodded. "Go pee," Chris whispered, "in the men's room." Emily smiled. It was, all in all, a pretty good dare, and it wasn't nearly as bad as sticking your rear end out a window. If anyone was in there, she'd just say it was a mistake and walk back out. Chris would never know whether or not she'd actually gone to the bathroom. She glanced around first for the creep because she didn't want to have to walk past him, as crazy as that sounded. He was out of the dining room by now, probably back on shift slinging burgers. As she scooted out of the banquette, James and Gus looked up. I have to go to the bathroom," she said. Gus whispered. Gus wiped her mouth with a napkin. "I'll take you," she said. "No," Em cried. I can do it by myself." "Melanie lets you go alone?" Gus asked dubiously. Emily looked her in the eye and nodded. Gus turned to James, who shrugged. "This is Bainbridge," he said. "What's going to happen?" Gus watched Emily weave through the maze of bolted tables and chairs to the restrooms in the rear of the McDonald's. Then she turned her attention to Kate, who was finger painting the ketchup on the table. The men's room was to the left, the women's room was to the right. Emily glanced back at Chris to make sure he was looking, and then she went inside. In less than 5 minutes, she slid back onto the seat beside Chris. "Nice job," he said, and touched her arm. "It was no big deal," Emily murmured. "Oh, yeah?" he whispered. "Then how come you're shaking?" "It's nothing," she said, shrugging. But she would not look at him. She methodically ate a burger she could no longer taste, and slowly convinced herself that she had told him the truth. Ooh. Okay, let's see. What page did we start on? 53? Okay. Now, November 1997. Is it S? I don't know what that's supposed to be. I'm just going to say Barrett Delaney had spent most of her adult life trying to live down the fact that she was a lawyer named Sue. It had been years since she'd actually used her Christian name to sign for anything. But somehow, word always managed to get out. Some human resources joker looking for some easy laugh. Some credit card company soliciting it from her birth certificate. Someone picking up her high school yearbook. There were entire months that she had to convince herself the reason she became a prosecutor and not a defense attorney had to do with her love of justice and not self-doubt. She glanced at her clock, realized she was running late, and scrambled down the hall to the cafeteria. Anne-Marie Marone was already settled at a corner table with 2 styrofoam cups. The detective glanced up as she slid into the opposite seat. "Your coffee's getting cold." The best thing about Anne-Marie was that she'd known S. I guess she goes by S. Barrett Delaney when she'd known S. Barrett Delaney when S. Barrett Delaney was still Sue. Yet she never called her that. They'd gone to school together at Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrow in Concord. That sounds like a depressing school. Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrow. That's the name of the school that they went to. "So," Barry said, simultaneously opening the lid on her coffee and the manila file that housed the police statements, the autopsy report on Emily Gold, and Anne-Marie's notes on Chris Hart. "This is everything?" "Everything so far," Anne-Marie said. She took a sip of her own coffee. "I think you've got a case." "We've always got a case," Barry muttered, engrossed in the evidence. "The question is, do we have a good one?" She read the first few lines of the autopsy report, then hunched forward, her hands twisting the gold cross around her neck. "Tell me what you know," she said. "Officers were called in at the sound of a gunshot. They found the girl unresponsive, 3 shades shy of dead. Boy was shocky and bleeding profusely from a head wound." "Where was the gun?" "On the carousel where they were sitting. Some alcohol was found too, a bottle of Canadian Club. 1 bullet had been fired, 1 was still in the revolver. Ballistics matched the bullet with the gun, and we don't have the fingerprints back yet." She blotted her lips with a napkin. When I interviewed the boy, before which, Barry interrupted, you of course read him his rights. Well, actually, Anne-Marie grimaced. Not line for line, but I had to get in there, Barry. He was fresh out of the ER, and his parents didn't want me around at all. Go on, Barry prompted. She listened as Anne-Marie finished her story, then sat silently for a moment. She picked up the remaining pages in the file and scanned them, occasionally murmuring, okay, she said. This is what I think. She looked up at her friend. To make a murder one charge stick, we've got to find premeditation, willfulness, and deliberation. Was this a deliberate act? Yes, or he wouldn't have taken the gun from his house. You don't carry an antique Colt around like a spare set of keys. Did he think about killing the girl even for a minute? Obviously, since he'd carried the gun from his house hours before. Was it a willful act? Assuming his intent the whole time was to kill the girl, then yes, he carried through with his plan. Anne-Marie pursed her lips. His alibi is that it was a double suicide that got botched up before he had his turn. Well, that tells us he's smart enough to think on his feet. Nice explanation. He just got what the forensic evidence would show. What do you think about a charge of sexual assault? Barry flipped through the detective's notes. I doubt it. Number one, she's pregnant, so they've had sex before. And if they've been having sex for a while, it'll be hard to make a rape charge stick. We can still use the evidence as signs of a struggle. She glanced up. I need you to question him again. 10-1, he'll have a lawyer. See what you can get, Barry urged. If he won't talk, try family and neighbors. I don't want to run off half-cocked. We need to know if he realized the girl was pregnant. We need background on the relationship between the kids. Is there a pattern of abuse between them? And we need to find out whether or not Emily Gold was suicidal. Anne-Marie, who had been scribbling in her own notepad, looked up. While I'm working my butt off, what are you going to do? Barry grinned. Take this to the grand jury. The instant Melanie opened the door, Gus thrust her hand through it, holding the can of pitted black olives. I didn't have a branch, she said, as Melanie tried to slam it shut again. Determined, Gus wedged her shoulder through the narrow space, then the rest of herself, so that she was standing opposite from Melanie in the kitchen. Please, she said quietly, I know you're hurting, so am I, and it's killing me that we can't hurt together. Melanie's arms were crossed so tightly that Gus thought she looked in danger of squeezing herself into. I have nothing to say to you, she stiffly replied. Mel, my God, I'm sorry. Gus said, her eyes shining with tears. I'm sorry that this happened. I'm sorry that you feel this way. I'm sorry that I don't know the right thing to say or do. The right thing, Melanie said, is to leave. Mel, Gus said, reaching out for her. Melanie actually shuddered. Don't touch me, she said, her voice vibrating. Gus recoiled, shocked. I'm sorry. I'll come back tomorrow. I don't want you to come back tomorrow. I don't want you ever to come back. Melanie took a deep breath. Your son, she said, crisply biting off each word, killed my daughter. Gus felt something small and hot spark beneath her ribs, fanning itself, spreading. Chris told you and the police that they were going to commit suicide. Now, granted, I didn't know they were. Well, you know. But if Chris says it, I believe it. You would, Melanie said. Gus narrowed her eyes. Listen, it isn't like Chris walked out of this fine and dandy. He had 70 stitches. He spent 3 days in a psychiatric ward. He told the police what happened when he was still in shock. What reason could he possibly have to lie? Melanie laughed outright. Do you hear yourself, Gus? What reason could he have to lie? You just don't want to believe your daughter could have been suicidal without your knowing it, Gus shot back. Not when you two had the perfect relationship. Melanie shook her head. As opposed to you? You can handle being the mother of a suicide risk, but you can't possibly accept being the mother, oh my God. But you can't possibly accept being the mother of a murderer. Gus had so many comebacks, so many indignant responses, that they blistered the back of her throat. Convinced they would burn her alive, she pushed past Melanie and out the kitchen door. She ran home, gulping cold draughts of air, and tried to push from her mind the knowledge that Melanie would consider her flight a surrender. I feel stupid, Chris said. His knees were up to his chin in the teeny wheelchair. But it was the only way the hospital would let him off the grounds. In this dumb, invalid contraption, and with a piece of paper printed with his name on the psychiatrist, oh my God, and with a piece of paper printed with the name of the psychiatrist he would now be seeing twice a week. It's for liability reasons, his mother said, as if he cared, and walked into the elevator beside the orderly who was pushing him. Besides, you'll be out in 5 minutes. 5 minutes too long, Chris grumbled, and his mother rested her hand on his head. I think, she said, you're already feeling better. His mother started chattering about what they were having for dinner, and who had called to ask about him, and did he think it was going to snow before Thanksgiving this year. He gritted his teeth, just trying to block her out. What he wanted to say was, stop trying to act like nothing happened, because something did, and you can't make it go back to being the same. Instead, he looked up when she touched his face, and he forced a smile. She slipped an arm around his waist as the orderly dumped them out at the lobby. Thank you, she said to the man, and headed for the sliding glass doors with Chris. Outside, the air was wonderful. It snaked into his lungs, bigger and fresher than the air in the hospital. I'm going to get in the car, his mother said, while Chris leaned against the brick of the hospital. I'm going to get the car. I'm going to get the car, his mother said, while Chris leaned against the brick of the hospital. Past the highway, he saw the gray knobs of the mountains, and he closed his eyes for a minute, memorizing them. At the sound of his name, he blinked. Detective Marone was standing there, blocking that beautiful view. Chris, she repeated, I wonder if you'd be willing to come down to the station. He wasn't under arrest, but his parents had been against it anyway. I'm only going to tell her the truth, Chris had assured them, but his mother had just about fainted anyway, and his father had to run off to find a lawyer who would meet them at the station. Detective Marone had pointed out that at 17, Chris could call his own shots in terms of legal representation, and he had to give her credit for that. He had to give her credit for that. He followed her down the narrow corridor of the police station to a small conference room with a tape recorder on the table. She read him his Miranda rights, which he recognized from his government course, and turned on the tape recorder. Chris, she said, I'd like you to tell me in as much detail as possible what happened the night of November 7th. Chris folded his hands on the table and cleared his throat. Emily and I had talked at school, and we decided I'd pick her up at 7:30. You have your own car? Yeah, it was, there when the cops came, a green Jeep. Detective Marone nodded. Go on. We had brought along something to drink. Something? Alcohol. I had brought it. Why? Chris shifted. Maybe he shouldn't have been answering all these questions. As if Detective Marone realized she was pushing too hard, she asked something else. Did you know that Emily wanted to kill herself? Yes, Chris said. She had a plan worked out. Tell me about this plan, Detective Marone pressed. Was it a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing? No, Chris said. It was just what Emily wanted. She wanted to kill herself. Yes, Chris answered. And then what? Then, he said, I was going to kill myself. What time did you pick her up? 7:30, Chris replied. I already said that. Right, and did Emily tell anyone else she was going to kill herself? Chris shrugged. I don't think so. Did you? No. The detective crossed her legs. Why not? Chris stared into his lap. Emily already knew. I didn't care if anyone else did. And what did she tell you? He began to trace a pattern on the table with the nail of his thumb. She kept saying she wanted to keep things exactly as they were, and that she wished she could stop everything from changing. She got really nervous, like talking about the future. She once told me that she could see herself now, and she could also see the kind of life she wanted to have. Kids, husband, suburbs, But she couldn't figure out how to get from point A to point B. Is that how you felt too? Sometimes, Chris said softly, especially when I thought about her dying. He bit his bottom lip. Something was hurting him, he said. Something that she couldn't even tell me. Every now and then, when we, his throat closed and he looked away. Could I have a minute? The detective dispassionately shut off the recorder. When Chris nodded, red-eyed, she hit the button again. Did you try to talk her out of it? Yeah, Chris said, 1,000,000 times. That night and before. Where did you all go to that night? To the carousel. The one by the old fairground, that's a kid's park now. I used to work there. You chose the place? Emily picked it. What time did you arrive? About 8, Chris said. After you stopped for dinner? We didn't have dinner together, Chris said. We ate at home. What did you do next? Chris exhaled slowly. I got out of the car and opened Em's door. We carried the bottle of Canadian Club over to the carousel and sat down on one of the benches. Did you have sexual intercourse with Emily that night? Chris's eyes narrowed. I don't think that's any of your business. All of this, Detective Marone said, is my business. Did you? Chris nodded, and the detective gestured toward the tape recorder. We did, he said quietly. And this was a consensual act? Yes, Chris ground out, his jaw tight. You're certain? Chris flattened his palms on the table. I was there, he said. Did you show her the gun before or after having sex? I don't remember. After, I guess. But she knew you were bringing it? It was her idea, Chris said. The detective nodded. And was there a specific reason you took Emily to the carousel to kill herself? Chris frowned. Emily wanted to go there, he said. It was Emily's choice. Emily wanted to go there, he said. It was Emily's choice? Yeah, Chris answered. We talked in circles about it before finally agreeing. Why the carousel? Emily always liked it, Chris said. I guess I did too. So, Anne-Marie said, you sat down on the carousel, had a drink, watched the sun go down, had sex. Chris hesitated, then reached over and shut off the tape recorder. The sun had already gone down. It was 8 o'clock, he said quietly. I told you that. He looked the detective in the eye. Don't you believe what I'm telling you? Anne-Marie flipped open the recorder and ejected the tape without ever glancing away from Chris. Should I? She asked. And that's where we're going to end for today. All right, so we're ending on page 74. So this was reading number 5, and we are ending on page 74. And I should have the discussion for this up either later today or tomorrow. Yeah, it's definitely getting better, and I'm super excited for the next discussion. I love talking about this stuff. I love reading it, but I love talking about it just as much. So, oh my gosh. Sorry, it's like literally, it's 6:28 in the morning. Can y'all see that? Okay. I woke up randomly. I've been waking up at like 4 a.m. every day for some reason, so I'm awake. But yeah, anyways, thank you for hanging out with me today. I hope you guys are enjoying this book as much as I am. I love you guys, and I'll see you guys later. I hope you guys are enjoying it.
How y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.